The American Revolution was not born overnight. It grew out of years of tension, a clash of ideals, and a web of events that began decades before the first musket was fired. By the mid-18th century, Britain's 13 colonies in North America had thrived. They had bustling ports, expanding frontiers, and flourishing trade networks. They also had their own legislatures, assemblies, and a tradition of self-government that, while still loyal to the crown, gave them a sense of autonomy. Most colonists still saw themselves as proud British subjects. They fought alongside Britain in the 7 Years' War, believing they shared in the rights of Englishmen. But when that war ended in 1763, the seeds of revolution were sown. The war had been costly for Britain. The empire had doubled its national debt and expanded its holdings in North America, taking control of vast French territories. To British officials, it was reasonable that the colonies should help shoulder the financial burden of defending and administering these new lands. To the colonists, however, the new policies felt like shackles. Parliament began enforcing old trade restrictions and passing new revenue laws: the Sugar Act in 1764, the Stamp Act in 1765, and later the Townshend duties. These taxes struck at daily life: paper documents, legal contracts, newspapers, tea. For colonists used to local assemblies handling taxation, the principle was clear: this was taxation without representation. The protest spread. Crowds filled the streets of Boston and New York. Effigies were burned, tax collectors were harassed, and organized groups like the Sons of Liberty began to emerge. Pamphlets and broadsides stirred outrage, while boycotts of British goods proved remarkably effective. Britain repealed the Stamp Act under pressure, but quickly reasserted its authority, declaring it had the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The clash was not simply about money. It was about power, legitimacy, and the very definition of liberty. Over the next decade, tensions flared into violence. In March 1770, British soldiers stationed in Boston fired into a crowd after a tense confrontation, killing 5 civilians. Patriots branded it the Boston Massacre, a symbol of British tyranny. 3 years later, when Parliament granted the East India Company a monopoly to sell cheap tea in the colonies, colonists saw it as a trap to force acceptance of Parliament's right to tax. One December night in 1773, disguised men boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the sea. The act, later immortalized as the Boston Tea Party, was not just vandalism, it was a direct defiance of imperial power. Britain's response was swift and severe. The Coercive Acts of 1774, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston's port, altered Massachusetts' government, and allowed soldiers to be quartered in private homes. Instead of breaking resistance, these measures united the colonies. Delegates from 12 colonies convened in Philadelphia as the First Continental Congress, issuing petitions to the king, organizing boycotts, and declaring that if Britain used force, the colonies would defend themselves. By then, compromise was slipping out of reach. The spark came in April 1775. British troops marched to Concord to seize colonial weapons, but militia gathered at Lexington to resist. Shots were fired, and though no one could agree who pulled the trigger first, the shot heard round the world had been fired. Skirmishes erupted along the road back to Boston, leaving scores dead. Within weeks, militia forces surrounded Boston, and the revolution had begun. At Bunker Hill in June, colonial fighters proved they could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars, inflicting heavy casualties before retreating. Meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress organized a Continental Army, placing George Washington, a Virginian planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, in command. Still, many colonists hoped for reconciliation. The Olive Branch Petition was sent to the king, pleading loyalty while demanding redress. But King George III dismissed it, declaring the colonies in open rebellion. As bloodshed continued, the idea of independence gained momentum. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in early 1776, spread like wildfire. Paine argued that monarchy was a corrupt relic, that America was destined for independence, and that a new kind of government, built on liberty, was possible. By July, the Continental Congress voted for separation. On July 4, 1776, they approved the Declaration of Independence, authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson. It was more than a list of grievances, it was a manifesto of Enlightenment ideals that governments exist by the consent of the governed, and that when they become destructive, the people have the right to alter or abolish them. The war that followed was brutal and uncertain. In 1776, British forces descended on New York, overwhelming Washington's army in a series of defeats. Yet Washington's daring retreats saved the cause. On Christmas night, he led a surprise crossing of the icy Delaware River, defeating Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. Days later, he struck again at Princeton. These small but symbolic victories kept the Revolution alive when morale had nearly collapsed. The real turning point came in 1777. British General John Burgoyne's grand plan to cut off New England ended in disaster at Saratoga, where American forces forced his surrender. This victory convinced France that the Americans could win. In 1778, France formally allied with the United States, providing money, supplies, and eventually troops and ships. Spain and the Netherlands joined the wider war, forcing Britain to fight not just in America, but across the globe. The war spread south. British forces captured Savannah in 1778 and Charleston in 1780, dealing the Americans severe losses. Yet the South became a landscape of fierce partisan warfare. Patriots and Loyalists clashed in brutal skirmishes, families and communities torn apart. American General Nathanael Greene adopted a strategy of attrition, refusing to fight decisive battles, instead wearing down British forces through constant maneuver and guerrilla tactics. In 1781, the decisive moment arrived. British General Cornwallis fortified at Yorktown, Virginia, expecting rescue by sea. But a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse blocked the Chesapeake Bay, while Washington and French General Rochambeau rushed their armies south. Together, they trapped Cornwallis. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered on October 19, 1781. The war dragged on in scattered skirmishes, but Britain's political will collapsed. Peace negotiations began, and in 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States, granting it vast territory stretching to the Mississippi River. The Revolution, however, was not only a military victory, but a social upheaval. For enslaved Africans, it was a moment of both hope and tragedy. Thousands fled to British lines, lured by promises of freedom. Some gained liberty, resettled in Canada, or were transported to Sierra Leone. Yet in the new United States, slavery endured, expanding even as northern states began gradual emancipation. For indigenous nations, the revolution was catastrophic. Many had sided with the British, hoping to stop colonial expansion. With Britain's defeat, their lands were quickly encroached upon, treaties ignored, and displacement accelerated. Women, too, bore heavy burdens running farms, managing shops, serving as spies and couriers. They emerged with new recognition as essential contributors, though their political rights remained absent, leaving them in the role of Republican mothers, tasked with raising virtuous citizens for the Republic. Loyalists, neighbors, merchants, and officials who had sided with Britain faced confiscation, violence, and exile. Tens of thousands fled to Canada, the Caribbean, or back to Britain, reshaping societies wherever they went. Even victory did not resolve all struggles. The new United States, governed under the Articles of Confederation, found itself weak and disorganized. Without power to tax, the central government struggled to pay debts and soldiers. Economic hardship, trade rivalries, and unrest, such as Shays' Rebellion in 1786, showed that the Confederation could not endure. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia and drafted the Constitution, a stronger framework balancing federal and state power, executive and legislative branches, and embedding compromises on slavery and representation. The fight over ratification was fierce, but it ended with promises of a Bill of Rights in 1791, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, due process, and more. The revolution left a world transformed. Sovereignty was claimed to rest in the people, not kings. Written constitutions replaced inherited authority. The American example inspired revolutions in France, Haiti, and Latin America. Yet it also left contradictions unresolved: liberty alongside slavery, equality alongside exclusion, democracy alongside dispossession. What began as protests against taxes had blossomed into a struggle that created not just a nation, but an idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, that power could be checked, and that rights were not granted by rulers but born with every individual. It was an experiment fragile and unfinished, but one that reshaped the course of human history.